Jessie Hagopian is a member of the Black Lives Matter at School Steering Committee and teaches ethnic studies at Seattle's Garfield High School. Hagopian is an editor for Rethinking Schools magazine, the co-editor of the book Teaching for Black Lives from 2018, and the editor of the book More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High Stakes Testing, which came out in 2014. He serves as the director of the Black Education Matters Student Activist Award and is the recipient of both the 2019 Racial Justice Teacher of the Year Award from the NAACP Youth Coalition and the Social Justice Teacher of the Year Award from Seattle Public Schools. Denisha Jones is also a member of the National Black Lives Matter at School Steering Committee and director of the Art of Teaching, a graduate teacher education program at Sarah Lawrence College. Denisha is an education justice advocate and activist. She serves as the co-director for Defending the Early Years, a nonprofit organization working for a just, equitable, and quality early childhood education, and is the assistant executive director for the Badass Teachers Association. Currently, her research focuses on utilizing the BLM at school curriculum as a cultural citizenship and documenting the value of play as a tool for liberation with an emphasis on global approaches to play. The book Black Lives Matter at School, An Uprising for Educational Justice is a collection of essays written by students, educators, and activists, and is the subject of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming editors Jessie Hagopian and Denisha Jones.
Thank you so much, Candace. We appreciate you. It's great to be with you, Denisha. I appreciate you staying up late on the East Coast for this talk.
Yeah, it's a little late, but I had a lot of planning in advance, so I'm ready.
Right on, right on. A little late coffee. I know you've had a big day. Thank you to Town Hall for hosting this event as well. And happy Black History Month, everybody. It's really great to be with you. Shout out to Carter G. Woodson for creating Black History Week and all of his incredible contributions as one of the great Black educators. And, you know, the first week of February was Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. That's now been our 4th annual week of action, the 5th if you count the actions that happened in Seattle and then in Philadelphia the first year. And this year was an overwhelming success. It was incredible to see the week of action just blossom all over the country. We, in fact, tripled in size the number of communities that registered around the country as having participated in this week, with many more in the South and even some in Canada this year, participating and teaching lessons about the 13 principles of the Black Lives Matter Global Network that teach an intersectional approach to understanding Blackness, and also lifting up the 4 demands of the movement. And then we saw California, the state of California's legislature actually passed a resolution endorsing Black Lives Matter at School Week for all of the California public schools. The second largest teachers union in the country, the American Federation of Teachers, finally passed a resolution supporting our Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action to join the NEA in that honor. And it's just amazing to see the number of students and parents and teachers who are in this struggle to uproot institutional racism. And this year we did something new. We actually added in what we call now the Year of Purpose, so that every month there's a different day of action. And there's a series of 5 questions that we want every educator to ask themselves about anti-racist pedagogy throughout the year. And I'm so thrilled to get to help present the new book that we edited. Thank you so much, Denisha, for pulling me into this project. And I just want to start by reading the very first words of my chapter in the book. And I start with a quote from Marche Das. a student in Los Angeles and a member of Students Deserve. And she says, quote, "How do you make Black Lives Matter in school when the whole system wasn't even built for us? I'll tell you how. You tear it down and you build it into something that is made for us. So that's what we're doing. Step by step, policy by policy, person by person, we're tearing it down and we're rebuilding it into a system that is meant to make sure that Black Lives Matter in schools." And I want to tell you the story of this movement and how it got started and what its goals are. But before I can tell you that story, I think I have to tell you the story of the fact that Black people were not allowed to learn to read and write. It was illegal under slavery for enslaved Africans to learn to read, to write. And yet Black people snuck off plantations and taught each other how to read and write at great personal risk. They called it stealing a meeting. And they knew that there was no liberation without education, and that literacy was key to their emancipation. And I want to tell you the story of Black Lives Matter at school, but I can't do it until we first acknowledge that there was an incredible effort in the Reconstruction era, in the years after the Civil War, that built the first public schools across the South, largely led by Black educators starting new schools and building integrated schools. In the 1860 in the South, you had white and Black children learning side by side, and actually white children immensely benefiting from the emancipation of Black people, because poor white children were getting to attend schools for the first time set up by Black educators. And I want to tell you about Black Lives Matter at school, but first we should acknowledge that in the 1920s and 30s, there was an organization called simply the Teachers Union in New York City that was organized by members of the Communist Party. And they collaborated with the NAACP, and they identified the racist textbooks in the city that were glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, and worked to replace them with anti-racist curriculum for the schools. And we want to talk tonight about Black Lives Matter at school, but we have to acknowledge that we stand in a tradition that really was illuminated during the civil rights movement with the freedom schools, right? When people like Septima Clark, the incredible educator, contributed to creating schools that were about liberation, and the final exam wasn't some multiple choice high stakes test. It was going out and registering to vote, right? And the Afrocentric schools that flourished in the 1970s across this country. And that's the tradition we stand in. And this movement really was launched in 2016 here in Seattle, when a group of educators at John Muir Elementary School wanted to wear a shirt that said Black Lives Matter, we stand together, and hold an event where they invited Black families to come and stand with them and high-five the students on their way into school that morning, and have an assembly for Black History in September, starting the year off, letting the children know that they were valued and seen in that school. And then a white supremacist made a bomb threat against John Muir Elementary for their audacity to publicly proclaim that their Black students' lives have value. And the school district officially had to cancel that event, and they brought in bomb-sniffing dogs that morning to see if there was a bomb. And I got in touch with some of the educators there, brought them to a meeting of the Social Equity Educators Group here in Seattle. And we came up with the idea of passing a resolution in our union calling for October 19th to be Black Lives Matter at School Day, and calling for every educator to wear a shirt that said Black Lives Matter, because we knew they couldn't threaten every school. And partnering with the NAACP and the PTA of Seattle and the Black student unions, we were able to build a coalition and get some 3,000 educators out of the 5,000 in Seattle to wear shirts that said Black Lives Matter to school. And then our action caught the headlines, And the educators in Philadelphia saw what we had done, and they took it to a whole nother level, expanding it to a week of action and breaking down those 13 principles of the Black Lives Matter Global Network into teaching points for each day of the week. And Denisha helped to spread this to become a truly national movement later, and she'll talk more about that. But I want to just say a word about why this movement is so urgent in our schools today. And I think the urgency of undoing anti-Blackness in our schools was driven home right here in Seattle just a few weeks ago when KUOW released an investigative report that showed that a student named Jaleel, a Black student in a school up north here in Seattle, was regularly locked up in an outdoor enclosure they called the cage for having temper tantrums, developmentally appropriate behavior for a second grader. And they actually would unlock the cage and slide his tray of food to him, and he would eat his lunch on the cold, hard concrete without a chair or a desk. And students, predominantly white students, would walk by and point and laugh and stare at him, really normalizing the imprisonment of Black people from such a young age. And this horrific action was reported to the Seattle Public Schools that actually did not stop this practice from happening to Jaleel. And that kind of trauma is being visited on Black students in Seattle and across the country on a daily basis, both physical and mental trauma. The mental trauma of students, Black students who are erased in our curriculums, that don't see the immense contributions that Black people have made to this country in the curriculum, and the physical trauma of over-policing and punishment that we see in our schools on a daily basis. You know, there's some really horrific examples of a 6-year-old girl who was arrested for having a temper tantrum in a Florida school last year, handcuffed, dragged to a car, taken to a youth jail where she was fingerprinted and had her mugshot taken. There was the example in New Mexico of a police officer who threw an 11-year-old girl into a brick wall because he believed she took an extra carton of milk. But we know that in America today, there are 14 million children that go to a school with a police officer, but the school lacks one of the following: a school psychologist, a counselor, or a social worker. And there we plainly see the priorities of a system that is more invested in locking children up than in unlocking their mind and their potential. And I would suggest to you all tonight that our American school system is really based on fear and shame. And they want to use education as a way to shame Black people into believing that they deserve their lot because they didn't achieve or they didn't score well on a standardized test. And what's truly shameful is that President Biden on the campaign trail made a promise to end standardized testing, and then Monday decided to renege on that and mandate testing. And I want to give a shout out to Denisha, because Denisha was the one that stood up at a town hall forum and challenged President Biden to make that pledge to end standardized testing. And there's a video going around on social media that you have to see of her challenging him. And Biden actually says, yes, I'll get rid of standardized testing. And now he's reneged on that. And one of the big reasons why they're getting ready to, in the middle of a global pandemic, implement this test and punish regime this spring is this racist narrative of quote unquote learning loss, right? And, you know, they say that we need to measure how much Black and brown children have lost in learning. And that's why they need to enrich testing companies with billions of dollars in testing contracts. But the fact is, we know our youth, particularly our BIPOC youth, are suffering as a result of this pandemic. But I would liken the people who advocate for high stakes testing during a pandemic to those who would insist that we take a child's temperature after they've been rescued from a boat in the waters of an Arctic Ocean, right? I mean, it's absurd and it's cruel because we already know that that child is suffering from hypothermia. And instead of taking their temperature over and over and over again, what we need to do is wrap them up in a warm blanket. And in the case of the public school scenario, what we need to do is wrap our children in wraparound services if we want them to begin healing. Things like a nurse in every school, trauma counseling in every school, smaller class sizes. These are the things that we know our children deserve and need to thrive. And the other thing I think that the learning loss narrative misses is the great strengths and the brilliance of our Black students that actually are way ahead of the rest of students in many respects, unless we want to reduce the intellectual process of learning to a single test score. You know, we often hear people talk about the achievement gap and how Black students are behind all the time, but what that misses is the fact that Black students are actually achieving at high rates when we look at the ability to identify problems in society and then develop collective solutions to those problems. And that was put on display this summer in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and so many others. Our Black youth taught this country a lesson, and I think developed the greatest group project I've ever seen when they took the streets and linked arms and showed the nation the depths of institutional racism and the power of solidarity to fight oppression. You know, my friend Dr. Kienga Yamada Taylor wrote an article for the New Yorker that I think really spells out why this narrative of learning loss due to remote schooling under COVID-19 is really part of a long racist narrative. And she wrote, the dystopian imagery of a lost generation of Black youth is redolent of earlier moral panics. The discoveries of, quote, crack babies in the 1980s and the, quote, super predators in the 90s were also rooted in anecdote-driven pseudoscientific evidence. Today's evidence for the spiral of Black children is the tactically vague measurement of learning loss, but no one needs to invent a new metric to discover that during the worst crisis in modern American history, students might be falling behind. It stands to reason that those students who were already victims of the maldistribution of wealth and resources that mars the entire enterprise of public education in the United States would fall behind even more, as those inequalities are mapped on the new stresses created by the pandemic. And so I want to challenge us today to abandon the language of the achievement gap, that deficit language of the achievement gap, and instead talk about an education debt, as Gloria Ladson-Billings has termed it, because a new study came out that showed that schools serving kids of color receive $23 billion less than those that serve predominantly white schools. We need to talk about the education debt, and folks need to know that Black Lives Matter at school is coming to collect on that debt. And I want to just end my remarks tonight with the words of one of my students. Israel Presley was a student in my world history class at Garfield and in my ethnic studies course. And he helped to organize a group called New Generation and was also part of the NAACP Youth Coalition. And I interviewed him for our book, Black Lives Matter at School. And he said this: during the Black Lives Matter at School week of action, I learned that Blackness could be part of every subject in school. I was finally being taught things about myself. I learned about Black contributions to science in science class. I had a math teacher at Garfield who did excellent work, Miss Din. She didn't use math to talk about the negative statistics of Black people. No, She used math to talk about the possibilities that we could achieve. It felt very powerful. Black Lives Matter at School has showed us that our community can organize a fight and come together to celebrate ourselves and our accomplishments. We are no longer living in a history of defeat. We are living in a future of success. And hope that everyone will join us in that struggle. So thanks for being here tonight. And I want to turn it over to you, Denisha.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for getting us started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I did want to pick up where Jesse started about this historical perspective, right? So I'm going to read from you from Brian Jones's chapter in the book, right? And he says, in 400 years on this land, Black people have waged an uninterrupted battle for education. The equally persistent and ongoing resistance to their demands for reform should give us all pause. To get some small measure of access, they have had to draw up petitions and make demands of existing institutions. At the same time, they have developed and built their own resources and institutions, creating their own curricular materials and even their own schools. The Black Lives Matter at School movement shares these aims. It calls upon you, the reader of this chapter, to join in demanding more from our schools and applying pressure to school and political officials. But it is a grassroots initiative, created, conceived, and coordinated by parents, teachers, and students nationwide, not by officials. Not unlike the early development of Negro History Week, the Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action is, at heart, a do-it-yourself movement, inviting you to take action now, teach Black history now, affirm Black students now, regardless of whether the demands are met. And so I found that really powerful. Brian framed the historical, our work in this historical perspective, looking at our demands and how, they've been ongoing, right? And so as I look at this work that we're doing, right, and thinking about how we use these 13 guiding principles, right, of the Black Lives Matter movement to be the foundation of what it is we're putting forth, how we issue these demands, right, to call for what it is that we want in schools for Black children, and how we show up and do the work, right, in our lessons and our activities, all the resources we put out for free. We could, work with a publisher and publish curriculum materials that you have to buy, but that's not what this is about, right? We put these materials together. Our National Curriculum Committee is a volunteer-led effort, right, to put out these resources. And it's really important to see that we are just continuing the work that our ancestors have done for us and have shown us the path. And so the way I see this work and why it's so important is when I think about quotes from Audre Lorde, right? So Audre Lorde, a Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet, taught us that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. These words remind us that systems put in place to maintain white supremacy will never be the same systems that liberate us. We need new tools. White supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy are the master's tools. And in many ways, the institution of schooling has also been the master's tool. Since its inception, public schooling in America has been a tool to support the master's house. As Jesse mentioned, we were denied an education, a formal education under this system, right? So it's always been working against us. Despite being labeled the great equalizer and necessary to ensure the live meritocracy, the institution of schooling reinforces America's racial caste system by sorting students into winners and losers and forcing them to consume a diet of Eurocentric whitewashed knowledge that reinforces white supremacy and racial inferiority. Thus, schooling as it is cannot destroy the master's house. And I recognize that that's hard for a lot of educators to accept. What are we doing in a field if we're just perpetuating the status quo? If we're just reinforcing white supremacy and we're reinforcing all these systems of oppression? But we have to really think about what it is our tool. What tool do we have? Schooling is not the same as education, right? And so we really have to recognize the differences there. And specifically how education for liberation can be our greatest weapon to break apart the institution of schooling and tear into the foundation of the master's house. Black Lives Matter at School is a movement grounded in education for liberation. Liberatory education exposes the many facets that keep the master's house operating. Education for liberation supports learners' ability to recognize and name the systems of oppression that operate to keep them from living their life as a fully human citizen. So instead of succumbing to the poison that is internalized racial inferiority, liberatory education seeks to transport our minds and hearts to a space free from blame and self-doubt, where our greatness shines unencumbered by whiteness. You know, and as I mentioned, I see the citizen, as mentioned in my bio, I see the principles, right, as a form of Black cultural knowledge, right? And the universal demands, right, how we center Black joy and our commitment to teaching and honoring Black humanity. These are all the liberatory tools that this movement has given us. And it's so important that we enact on them. You know, as Jesse said, there is an education debt, and we owe Gloria Ladson-Billings for giving us that term to push back on that narrative achievement gap. And our demands of the movement are ways that you can immediately make a payment towards this debt, right? When we talk about implementing restorative justice and banning all zero tolerance and punitive discipline measures, that's going to pay down the debt owed from the school to prison pipeline that has been harming our students for generations. Hiring more Black teachers pays down the debt incurred when, instead of equalizing funding for Black schools, integration was used to fire Black teachers and force Black children in the classrooms of a hostile white teaching force, right? When we mandate Black history and ethnic studies, we pay down the debt from centuries of overfeeding society on a bland, false narrative of Eurocentric superiority. Funding counselors and getting cops out of schools pays down the debt of racial trauma and racist toxic stress waged on the minds and bodies of Black children, further victimized under the watchful gaze of what has become modern day slave patrols and overseers. Right? We have to make those historical connections between all the work that we're doing. And what really brings me to this movement, and what I think everyone is trying to do, is break the traditional ways of how we think about Blackness and Black children, right? Despite every attempt to break Black people, we continue to put forth Black joy. And Black Lives Matter at School centers Black joy in every lesson and every action that we take. We use the 13 guiding principles to make teaching for and learning through Black joy the norm. The beautiful struggle that is the Black experience is taught through a lens of Black community organizing, Black political capital, Black liberation, and Black joy. Instead of zeroing in on the pain of our enslaved ancestors, which is typically how Black history is taught, right? And their arduous fight for freedom, this movement insists that the full picture of our story is told. Black people are more than our pain, and our children have to understand that. Though we continue to struggle within the racial caste of America, our struggle is beautiful, and children must learn to see this beauty. We use Black joy as the mirror needed to see the beauty that is Black people in America and the world. A beauty so strong that despite repeated attempts to malign it at its core, it shines bright every day in the faces and smiles of our beautiful, brilliant Black children. So as we think about this movement, we want to understand, where is our place in this? What are we going to do to really make this happen? The Master's House strives to make Black humanity an impossibility. Black community can't exist under the reign of white supremacy. So the Master's tools teach us that Black people had no humanity until white saviors came along. But thankfully, our ancestors passed on their knowledge and wisdom to expose that fallacy. Black Lives Matter at School is a movement committed to teaching through and for Black humanity. Dedicated to queer Black feminist organizing, we uplift the humanity of all Black people as we center the work of queer, transgender, non-binary, and disabled Black folks as guides for doing this work. This is an intergenerational movement that recognizes the collective value of all Black people, including our diasporic Black family. As liberators of Black humanity, we recognize that only through loving Blackness are you worthy to educate Black children and support Black people. So although this work is challenging, and we're dealing with lots of issues, the resurgence of testing after pointing out to Biden at the time when he was a candidate, I actually said, given that these tests are built on racism and eugenics, right, pointing that out and having him say, yes, you're preaching to the choir, teachers don't need to give more tests, right? And seeing him, just walk away from that statement and understanding there is still hope in this movement. We are not going to give up, because now we know that something else is possible, right? We don't have to go back to the way things were. The pandemic has opened our eyes that schooling as it was before was not very good, right? It wasn't very good to begin with. And we have the tools to make it better. And as Jesse said, this year, teachers showed up and did the work. There's a section called Educators Doing the Work, because I couldn't think of a better way to describe what happens every year when we do this work. Hundreds of educators giving up their time on a Sunday to come to meetings, to talk about it, to plan weekly, to do the lessons, to go to the events, to get the speakers. That's work. That's a labor of love for Black lives that we see every year, not just for the week of action, but all the time, right? Because people were putting into this classroom early on. Lelania was like, I got to start teaching kids early about these principles if I want them to get them in by the time the week of action comes, right? So she's starting in October and November, introducing young children to principles. And we have this great book that she authored, and Karen Davidson did the illustrations for, What We Believe. Black Lives Matter, a Black Lives Matter Principles and Activity book, published by Lee and Low this year, right? This is the dedication to this work that we've seen, that educators keep showing up time and time. You know, I actually thought because of COVID this year, the numbers would be off. We were meeting virtually. Teachers are in this ridiculous place where they're teaching hybrid and in person at the same time, right? But literally every Thursday in New York City, we had 90 to 120 teachers on our call as we planned our week of action. Despite the snow that came and turned our rally from an in-person walk around Harlem to a virtual walk around Harlem, right? We had tons of people show up, filling up limited seats in some of our Zoom capacities, right? And this is what it means to be doing this work. As Bettina Love talks about abolitionist teaching, working for a future you may not ever see in your lifetime. We might not be around when Black Lives Matter without people having to say so, when schools affirm Black children all the time. But we work for that end regardless, because we know that future is possible. And so it's just, for me, it's just an incredible, I can't imagine being part of any other movement in my lifetime, right? When I was young, we used to think about, yeah, it would have been cool to be around during the civil rights era, women's rights, right? But no, I'm a living, breathing part of an awesome movement to really take education and make it what it's supposed to be for Black children. And so that is like, it's an honor and a privilege, right? Like we heard these stories being told, and I reached out to Jesse. He's like, we got to get this out there, the people. This is amazing that we've been doing this for years. We've been just coming together, right? After Philadelphia released their week of action, I mean, it's in my chapter, it's on the page. I actually took a screenshot of the Facebook post that I did. I was like, this is so dope. Check out what these educators just did in Philly. They created a resource called Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. And there are the 13 guiding principles grouped, and there are lessons for every age group. And that was all it took, right? I saw that, I reached out to them. I said, you guys got to present at Free Mind, Free People in Baltimore. A lot of us showed up to that meeting. We signed our name down on a piece of paper, and the national group was formed. Other people were at other events that summer, teach-ins on Ferguson. And the word just started spreading. Hey, they're doing something called Black Lives Matter at school. What is that? And somebody put out their Zoom link, and we were all on Zoom before Zoom became an everyday part of our lives, right? And it was just great to see what they did and to capitalize on that initial work, to move it from January to the first week in February, to enact the three demands at the time, and then the fourth demand, right? And to see it grow, the growth. We used to beg for people in the South and in the Midwest to join us because it was always New York and Seattle, right? And then we got LA, and then we got Iowa, and then we got Milwaukee, right? And then we're still getting some teachers in the South, right? North Carolina is going to come strong next year. I know Peter's going to bring it for their educators. They're currently doing a book study of our book, right? And they are going to do the Week of Action in North Carolina next year. And it just continues to grow and grow and grow because people understand that this is so important and that this is what children need. All children, right? We have a chapter dedicated, white teachers for Black lives. And what does it mean to do this work if you're a white educator? But we also have a kindergarten teacher who's a white teacher who teaches in a predominantly white school in Brooklyn, right? And what does it mean to bring this Black Lives Matter into white spaces? What does it mean for a little white child to see their white teacher telling them that Black lives matter and this is why? It's powerful beyond words, right? And so it's now's the time, right? Now's the time to keep doing this work, to keep pushing forward. We're going to push back against the standardized testing. We're going to push back against the 1776 project nonsense, right? We're going to continue to push back against anyone who says that Black children aren't entitled to go into a space that affirms who they are as Black children, as brilliant, as entitled to everything this world has to offer. So as you can see, I get very excited. So I want to turn it over now. I think we might have some questions from the audience, and hopefully they'll be plugging those in soon. I think we've got some right now. All right, so I'll read this out. Jesse, I think you might want to, we'll see who wants to take it. So much of these hysteria-driven crack babies and warped efforts test scores. Can we put the media under a spotlight as furthering these destructive campaigns? Do I need to go back 150 years? That's a great question.
Yeah, the media is perpetuating these racist narratives. And the new one, the learning loss hysteria, is really harmful. But I think what you said to Joe Biden needs to be better understood by everybody here today, that standardized testing first entered the public schools as a result of the eugenics movement. So it was Carl Brigham who wrote a book called A Study in American Intelligence. And in that book, on the final page of that book, he concludes that America's intelligence is going to dramatically plummet because we will fall behind Europe due to the fact that we have Black people here in our country, right? And so he was really one of the founding fathers of the eugenics movement, and he also developed the SAT exam that became the centerpiece of college admissions and really the model for how high-stakes standardized testing would be organized around multiple choice, culturally biased questions that researchers have showed over and over again that these tests, the thing that they measure the most accurately is your zip code. And that's because they show where you live and how segregated those neighborhoods are. And you know, if you can look at somebody's zip code, and if they're in a wealthy white neighborhood, you can predict what the test scores will be. And that's a damning statement about the way that these tests are used to reproduce inequality disguised as merit-based system, right? And thank you for challenging Biden on that, Denisha.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have a great friend in DC, Jeff Kennedy, who's done a lot of research on eugenics. I mean, a lot more. Like, I have a good understanding of eugenics, but he has like the complete knowledge about eugenics and how it's so prevalent in all of our systems today, in all of our education, right? Beyond even just the testing, right? It's everywhere. It's how we talk about these children and what we think is good enough for these children, right? And I also like, you know, Ibram Kennedy's work. He has an article out about why the achievement gap in itself is a racist idea. And that's what I really want to challenge people on, to think about this idea that there's this gap in achievement and how that sets up a racist idea to begin with, right? You know, and so, and it's not where we've been before. You know, I've been in education for a long time, and in grad school, I wrote lots of papers about how we can close the achievement gap through culturally relevant pedagogy. And now I'm like, damn it, we never really had a gap, right? We created a test to prove racial inferiority, and that's what it does time and time again. That's why you get a bell curve, right? Because that's what you're looking for, and that's what you're always going to get. And so I think that history is so important. And yeah, we do have to put the media under a spotlight, right? But it's more than it. Who benefits from standardized testing in the middle of a pandemic that has cost 500,000 lives, right? I think we crossed the 500,000 number, right? 500,000 deaths in the United States, right? Who benefits right now? Because let me tell you, last year, no tests. Yeah. 2 years with no tests.
How is it that the worst Secretary of Education ever was able to cancel the test, but now under the Biden administration,
we have to go forward, right? So, but think about it. If you're a testing company, if you make your money off of testing young children or testing children in schools, you see the death knell knocking at your door. 2 years and no test data, and it's over. right? And they know that. So what did they do? They let them cancel it last year. And then they've been peddling all this time. No, we can do the test virtually. We can do them at home. They're still really important, right? And we have to recognize that a lot of people who are protesting are funded by these companies, whether it's ETS or College Board or Pearson or any of the companies that make money off of this. They're contributing to Democrats and Republicans, right? And they know that. They know that if they go another year without testing, we were all going to celebrate when the end of standardized testing came crushing down around us. But it still can, because they can give a test, but you don't have to take it.
That's
right.
it.
And I heard from a colleague, right, that some parents were told, right, when you had to make the decision if you were sending your kids to virtual school or not, that you couldn't opt out of testing in virtual school. Can you imagine that this is what it was said, right, in some states? Right. Okay. So they made you sign your right away. So you know what you do, parents? Log on to the testing, and then your kid doesn't answer a single question. That is a form of opting out, right? They can't stop you. They cannot make your kid answer. No one can make your kid answer those questions, right? And it just goes to show that this is our chance. We have to reclaim this. The last thing children need right now are tests. And it's not because of learning loss, it's because the pandemic is traumatizing. It's been traumatizing for all of us. I'm afraid to get on a plane. I used to fly 10 times a year, and I am terrified to ever ride on a plane again, because that's what this pandemic has done to me, right? But we got to help young children build the resilience they need, not talk about learning loss. What I see when I observe students in my student teaching program, I see young kids navigating complex systems that I can't even figure out. They go from Zoom to Schoology to Google Classroom to this to that in a matter of minutes, but yet here we are talking about learning loss. What about all the things they've gained? They actually, no other child in this history of this world has had to go to school at home. There's been pandemics before, but there was no virtual schooling, right? That didn't even happen, right? These kids are the first to do this, and they're getting it done. And yes, it's hard. And yes, their social emotional needs are challenging right now. But rushing in to give tests, how is that going to help anybody, right? It just reinforces these same narratives. So, Jesse, I'm also going to field this question to you because you have some experience in Seattle, and about, Nathaniel Green, Janine in Minneapolis, about how you get the police out of school. So how much control do individual school districts have over whether or not they have police officers in their schools? Is that a government mandated thing or a district decision for how to allocate funds?
Yeah, that's a district decision about allocating funds. And it's time for every school district to remove the police. There's been too many horrific examples of abuse, and we need to move towards real public safety, right? We know that the safest communities in America are not the communities with the most police officers. The safest schools in America are not the schools with the most police officers. The safest communities and schools in America are the ones with the most resources, right? And so we know that when we build thriving communities and infuse them with the resources they need, they'll do great. And we have a chapter in the book with Nathaniel Janine, and he is the student representative on the Minneapolis Public School Board. And when George Floyd was killed just a few blocks from his house, he went down to the memorial and he recounts this traumatic evening that he reflected on his responsibility. And he helped to unify a lot of the groups that had been working to get police out of the schools for a long time, and helped to launch a petition that got many thousands of signatures, and then helped to convince the school board to ratify that. And they removed the police from the Minneapolis public schools, and it started a movement across the country. The St. Paul public schools removed the police, and the Oakland public schools removed the police, and Denver and Charlottesville, Virginia. And I'm proud to say right here in Seattle, because of Kiddist and Angelina, who started a petition here, they both work with the NAACP Youth Coalition and have helped been leaders in Black Lives Matter at schools for several years. And their petition got some 14,000 signatures in Seattle in just a couple days. And the school board then went from studying the issue to actually removing the police altogether from the Seattle public schools. And I just want to end by saying that this simple idea that I hope people will take with them is that whole people heal people and hurt people, right? So when we want to talk about ending violence or keeping our communities safe, we need to figure out how do we make people whole so that they can be part of a movement to heal our communities and our schools. Because when we know when our children are hurt by structural racism and poverty, they'll end up hurting others. There are 150 homeless kids at Garfield High School here in Seattle, right? This is a city with Amazon and Boeing and Starbucks and Microsoft, and the two richest people the world has ever known live here. And yet we don't have a nurse in every school in Seattle full time, and we don't have housing for our children. This is a public safety crisis, right? And if we want to create safe communities, we need to make sure that we provide the opportunities and the future that our youth deserve.
Yeah, I mean it's so mind-boggling, right? Even in New York City, I'm close to the city, right? We could just tax some billionaires, right? And every kid could have Wi-Fi and laptops and working, and remote learning could be off the chain good, and you could be engaging in deep projects and all sorts of critical thinking. But instead, we're just rushing to put people back into unsafe buildings because nobody wants to ask billionaires to pay their fair share. And it's unbelievable. This is an interesting question. Do you address learning spaces in school buildings at all in the book? How do we change the experiences of Black children in the way we design school buildings? That's a really great question. And it's something that I think about because I'm an early childhood person and I'm a huge play advocate. And play requires a lot of open space, right? And I can imagine, right, like Black children would thrive in the kind of open play spaces I saw when I visited Anji, China, and they have these amazing play spaces. It's not in the book, unfortunately, and maybe that's something to think about in our next edition, of course. But it is a really good question because I think the design, schools are designed like prisons a lot of time, right? I remember driving by a prison nearby me and I was like, it could be a school. It could go either way. I think because there was so much distance between the building and the barbed wire, that gave it away as a prison, right? But if it was a little bit closer, you'd be like, how can you tell the difference, right? And so we need to think about, school buildings designed as spaces to warehouse children. And that's what we're seeing right now in the pandemic, that schooling is an institution to warehouse children so capitalist workers can get to work, right? And now that space is not being used because of the pandemic, people are freaking out, right? They're not so much worried about the education. They're saying it's the education, but they really just want buildings back open so bodies can be back in there and adults can get back to doing this economy. So I don't know if you want to add anything there, Jesse, but we do have another question here too.
Just briefly, the way that they're trying to turn schools to look increasingly like prisons, it's really scary. With the use of metal detectors and surveillance and all of that. And we do need to build more joyful spaces. And, Rainier Beach High School here in Seattle, the last school not to be renovated. And of course, that's the school that also has the highest percentage of Black students, right? And so we do need to build joyful spaces for our Black kids.
We do. And there's people doing that work. They're thinking about community center spaces where kids can thrive and the freedom to move and all of those wonderful things. So we'll definitely be thinking more about that. Our next question is, we can agree that standardized testing has racist roots. How do we ensure progress monitoring or classroom/curriculum-based tests, often made by teachers, don't have these racist elements?
Yeah, I can start off.
Yeah, please do.
So of course, there can be ways that teachers who aren't culturally competent can create assessments or any educational materials that have bias built into them or are racist in certain ways. But there's a couple things that I would point out. Number one, high stakes standardized testing is about punishing, shaming, and destroying the futures of our Black youth. So one of the biggest problems is the stakes that are attached to the tests. For instance, there are exit exams that require students to pass these tests to graduate. And a study out of Boston University showed that the main outcome of exit exams is increasing incarceration rates by 12% in this country, right? So that is, I think, a clear difference between the kind of, high stakes standardized tests and classroom assessments. The other thing is, even if teachers make flawed assessments in their class, they're at least basing it on what the students were learning in the classroom, right? The thing about corporate standardized testing is they've created a test that is, based on what they want to test, not necessarily what the teacher values. And so one of the problems with the standardized tests is it narrows the curriculum. Teachers more and more start teaching to what's on a high stakes standardized test rather than what they actually believe in, what they know, what they're passionate about, what the students want to learn about. How about that? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those corporate exams distort our curriculum. And guess what's not on those tests, right? How to identify a problem in your community and organize collectively to solve it. The tests don't talk about the long Black freedom struggle, right? So we need to do what they do in the consortium schools. If you have not visited the website performanceassessment.org and learned about the consortium schools in New York, then you really should, because this is a network of schools that have they have a waiver and they don't have to give the standardized tests. And so if these tests were the key to closing the achievement gap, quote unquote, then those schools would have the worst outcomes for Black kids. But the thing is, they have the best outcomes because they use performance-based assessments and culturally relevant assessments for those kids. And I'll just end by saying that performance-based assessments are widely used in America, just not in K-12. But when you get your PhD, I hear, Denisha, you have to defend your dissertation. You do a thesis, right? And you develop that with a mentor. And if your research doesn't match your thesis, you have to revise your thesis. And then you have to defend it in front of a panel of experts. And that is a performance-based assessment that they model in the consortium schools in New York. And they have the best outcomes in the New York public schools for their Black and brown students, much higher graduation rates and college attendance rates.
Yeah, and of course, there's a moratorium on opening new consortium schools. I wonder why that is, right? We don't want too many Black children in New York City having access to schools that can document their brilliance instead of showing them on the losing end of a manufactured gap. All right, we got time for one more question, and I will read it, and then I'll start with a little bit of an answer. What point along the school to prison pipeline would you say needs the most or more focus, or is there a hole there that we are not yet seeing activism around? You are all working at the educational level, and I know of organizations at the prison level, but is there an in-between point that needs to be highlighted or that we need to know more about? Yes, as a former kindergarten teacher, I can tell you that it starts with our babies. There is an epidemic of preschool and kindergarten suspension and expulsion. And I'm going to say that again, preschool suspension and expulsion. We are kicking out Black boys and increasingly Black girls out of preschool for behaviors that are normal for 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, right? I was a director of a preschool, and there were some children there, of course, they have challenging behaviors. Why wouldn't they? They're 3 and 4, and they went from, being the star of their family to having to come into this space with all these strangers and like share time. And, it's a lot for them to handle, right? And there was one boy in particular who really was challenging, right? And I remember parents telling me, well, when are you going to just kick him out? And I said, I would not. I'd rather quit before I kicked out a 4-year-old from a preschool. Like, how am I doing my job if I'm kicking out a 4-year-old? But this is the norm, that parents feel that they can just tell you he's got to go. Where is he going to go at 4 years old if we're saying we don't have the skills to teach him or to work with him, to help him, just develop the skills? He just needed communication. He just needed to be able to vent and to learn proper ways to get people's attention, right? But that's not the attitude, right? So it really starts, it's young children. And I don't think people pay attention to that. And I get that sometimes it's not the teacher's fault. I was a kindergarten teacher, first year, struggling like no one's business, right? Two boys get into a fight. They stab each other with pencils. I'm by myself. What do? I send them to the principal's office. Like, give me a second. Like, take these kids out of here. Let me get the kids under control. Get the kids under the control. I go to get my boys. Oh no, they've been suspended. Excuse me? You did what? Oh, they broke the skin with those pencils. It's automatic suspension. I did not know that. And I was terrified. I was horrified to know that my actions led to these young. I didn't want them to be suspended. I wanted them to be given a timeout while I attended to the kids in the classroom and made sure we were okay. Right. So, but guess what? I never sent kids to the principal's office ever again. I don't care if there was like stitches involved. I wasn't calling the principal, right? I would handle it myself, right? Because I knew that that's an entry point for those two boys now to be suspended for a day or two in kindergarten. And it's happening more and more. As Jesse told that story of a young girl having a temper tantrum and being carted out in handcuffs by police. So I don't know if people recognize that, but a lot of preschools are private run organizations. So no one's really tracking the data, right? But they're kicking out kids. They're kicking out Black children and low-income children and Latinx children, right? For engaging in regular behaviors. And they're scaring their parents into thinking that these kids need to be medicated or there's something wrong with them. So I think it starts there. Jesse, if you want to add anything before we wrap up, please. But yeah.
Yes, thank you for raising that, Denisha. That's so true. And I'll just say that I think the struggle against the youth jail here in Seattle is an important part. It's a $200 million new facility that they built just a few blocks from where I teach. And the investment of that money to cage children is really a shame. And that money should go to supporting our youth. And I just want to end by giving a shout out to all the authors in this book that have made some incredible contributions to the struggle for Black education. And, you know, I really want to thank Okaikor for always raising and centering Black queer feminism in our politics, that says when we liberate the most marginalized amongst us, then we all get free, right? And Tamara Anderson, who has a chapter about how they organized this in Philly, and she really pushed everybody to adopt the 13 principles as teaching points, to teach about Black women and Black queer people, and to teach about Black trans people, and understand the intersectional nature of Black identity. And you know, Chris, who organizes the curriculum committee, has an incredible chapter about the curriculum, and so many students and parents and organizers. And I hope people enjoy the book. And I'll just finish by reading the dedication to the book, if that's all right. We write, to the Black children of the future who will one day all be taught the epic story of how Black people finally got free, and who will grow up knowing that their lives matter at school and everywhere else.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Seattle Town Hall. Thank you, Candace. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you both so much for presenting with us tonight. Thank you for your passion. This has been such a great talk to listen to. You know, I was just reflecting that 2020 showed us all how important education is to our society and how much improvement it needs. Even, you know, I think people who don't have kids yet, like me, you know, maybe don't before, we're kind of blind to it, but it's just so important. And I hope that the momentum for the Black Lives Matter curriculum just like keeps building and building. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
I want to thank our audience for watching as well. Thank you for your questions. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, please use the link in the chat below the video player. That's going to take you to purchase the book through Estelita's library, so help support them. And check out our calendar again online to see what else is coming up next. So Jesse and Denisha, thank you again so much. Hopefully we'll see you in person again soon. Please stay safe and have a great night.